Hi guys, this is Kelly from Cozy Reader Kelly, and today I'd like to share with you my mid-July wrap-up. And usually when I do a wrap-up, I order them by some of my favorites down to my least favorite, then back up. But this last 2 weeks, I did a lot of ones that were related to readathons and kind of categories. So instead, I'm going to kind of go by those readathons and categories to talk about the ones that I fulfilled for each of those. And the first readathon that I had participated in was the TBR Readathon, and it started back in May but went until July 8th. And in total there were 12 books we were supposed to read from our physical TBR. This was hosted by Irina at Beautiful Pages. I did do a TBR video for it, so I'll link that down below. If you watched that, I've stayed pretty close to my original TBR. I only kind of substituted out for the big over 500 page book. I substituted The Book Thief instead of Jane Eyre. I'm hoping to read Jane Eyre later this month. And then the first two challenges, the first one was to read a book from a series, and I did not finish that challenge. I started the book The Likeness by Tana French, and I got a chapter in, and I realized that it was something I wanted to wait until the fall to read because it's just kind of a really dense thriller, so I wanted to wait till I had a little more time to sit and enjoy that, and summer just didn't feel right for me. And then the other one I didn't complete was where you're supposed to read a book you've owned for a while, and I was originally going to read a bunch of short stories from David Sedaris, and I did start it, and I got one story in, and I realized I just really enjoy listening to his books instead of reading them, and I just couldn't get into it by just reading it. So I put that down, and I instead picked up The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells, and I didn't finish this in the time period of the readathon. I'm only halfway through, so I will finish this, but I just didn't get it done for the readathon. So I finished 10 of the 12 challenges. And then the next readathon I did was the Readathon, which is a Canadian readathon that was hosted by several people, but I learned about it from Books and Lala. And they did have challenges, but mainly they just wanted you to read books by Canadian authors. And so I ended up reading 2, so I didn't really go by the all of the challenges. I just picked 2 Canadian author books that I wanted to read. And so the first one I read was This One Summer by Jillian and Mariko Tamaki. This is a graphic novel, so they're cousins, and one writes the book, and then the other one does the drawings. And all the drawings for this one are kind of in like a purple tone. And I gave this a 3 stars. It was just kind of in the middle for me. It wasn't fantastic, but it wasn't bad. I read it in about an hour, and I just didn't fully connect to it, but I could see where it was a good story. Well written, but it just didn't really stick with me. And basically the story is about 2 girls. The main character, Rose, is the one we kind of follow, and then her and her other friend, who I think is Wendy. I'm not sure, but Rose is the one we're following. So she is at her lake house that her family goes to every summer, and her friend is kind of her summer friend. So her and Winnie just are friends in the summer at this lake house. And the reason they're focusing on this summer is this is kind of the summer that Rose kind of turns from a child into an adolescent, and kind of the things that she goes through this summer are part of that coming of age story. So if it might be really good for somebody who is of that age or teenage to read, they might connect with it more. I didn't really connect with the story. Are those that like to read a lot of coming of age, it might be more for you. So a lot of things happen this summer. She has a lot happening with her family. Her parents are arguing a lot and seem to have a lot of issues in their marriage. And it turns out something happened with her mother within the last year, which we don't find out about till towards the end, so I'm not going to tell you what it is. But there's a lot of emotions with that. And a lot of it we learn as the reader before the daughter learns. And so she kind of has that where she's really grouchy at her parents and not really realizing that there's more adult things happening there that she doesn't understand. And there's also a lot happening with the teenagers in the town, and she does a lot of eavesdropping on their conversations and what's going on in their lives. So we see into, especially one teenage girl, we kind of follow her story and what's happening to her and how Rose interacts with her. And some people might, if you read Goodreads and you see anything about slut shaming, there is what I would not call it slut shaming. Like, they call this girl a slut several times, but you can tell from the way the book is written that it's not meant to be slut shaming, that every time a character does it, it's somebody that you can tell as a reader that we're not supposed to like that they're doing it. Like, it's like the really jerk guy that wears the inappropriate t-shirts and says inappropriate things, and he does slut shaming, so obviously we don't agree with him as a reader. And then when Rose herself does the slut shaming, she's being really obnoxious and like just figuring out how to grow and like change, so we as a reader know we're not supposed to agree with her. Do you know what I mean? So some people have commented on Goodreads that they think it's a slut-shaming book, but I don't think that that's the point. Is that we're supposed to know that that's bad. And so when it's done in here, it's not done like that the book is supporting the slut-shaming, if you get what I mean. So we're kind of like, Rose is figuring out how to treat other women as she gets older. So that's all I have to say about that. And then the other book I read that was by a Canadian author was The Blue Castle by L.M. Montgomery. And she's the same author that did Anne of Green Gables, but this is an adult book. And I don't know if it's her only adult book, but it's the only one I've heard of. And this, of course, is written in the 1920s, so you're going to expect it to be kind of slower and more like G-rated kind of a romance. So I gave this 4 stars. And I really thought it was a sweet story. You have to go into it expecting it to just be a simple, quiet story. It doesn't have a lot of plot. It's more just following this woman named Valancy, who we start the book, she's just turned 29, and she's kind of going through a crisis because she's 29 and she doesn't have any prospects for marriage. And back at that time, if you weren't married in your 20s, then you were basically an old spinster, and she has absolutely no prospects at all. She's never even been on a date or had a man show interest in her, so her family has kind of written her off as being alone forever, and so is she. And so we're kind of following her story. And at the beginning, the reason I gave it 4 instead of 5 stars, because I did really like it, was that the beginning is really hard to get through. This is a short book, only like 215 pages or something like that. And the first 40 to 50 pages are really hard to read because it's just Valancy whining about her life and just complaining about how men don't like her, about how she doesn't like living in her room, she doesn't like her family, like complaining about everything in her life, that everything is wrong and bad. And she even brings up stuff that happened when she was a really young kid and she's still upset about it in her late 20s. So that part is really hard to get through, but then something happens at about the 40 or 50 page mark that changes the whole rest of the book and the whole rest of the story and her life. And that's kind of the point of the book, that something happens in her life that completely changes the trajectory of her storyline. And once we get to that part, I really enjoy the rest of the story. It was a story about discovering happiness, and it is a romance, but I wouldn't call it, it's definitely not a sexy romance. It's a very quiet romance, kind of a friendship blossoming kind of romance. So don't expect any like steamy parts in this book. I would say it is very PG, maybe even G rated when it comes to the romance. But I really enjoyed once I got past that part of just seeing her develop and seeing the way she viewed the world once she kind of got away from her family. Her family is horrible, and you really like feel her becoming her own person once she gets separate from them. And so I would recommend it if you are someone that likes classics or likes to read slower, simple kind of romances. I thought it was a good book. And so those are the only 2 ones I read for that readathon, the Canadian one. And then the next readathon I did was Tome Topple, which went from like June 29th until July 12th or something like that. And you were supposed to read books over 500 pages. And this was hosted by Sam from Thoughts on Tomes. And there were challenges, and I think I completed all the challenges except for one. I did not read a book in a series, but I read 2 books, and those 2 covered almost all the other challenges. The first book I read covered the challenge of reading a buddy read and an adult book, and then there was a challenge of reading 2 tomes, and I did do that. I read 2 books, and then you were supposed to read a graphic novel that was over 500, and I did that. So between those two, I completed almost all of the challenges. I just did not get around to reading the book I was going to read that was part of a series. I'll probably read it soon, but I just couldn't this time. So the two books I read, first of all, was All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, and this I rated it a 4.5 stars. It was so close to 5 for me, but the reason I didn't give it a 5-star is that the way this is written, it's following two perspectives, and the chapters are really short. Like sometimes the chapters are only like 2 or 3 pages long, and so when you're switching back and forth so quickly, sometimes I would get like jolted out of one person's story into the others too fast. But overall, I really loved everything about it. And I did this as a buddy read with Elizabeth from Literary Lizzie, and I really enjoyed doing it as a buddy read, and I really liked reading it in short snippets. We did 50 pages a day, and figure out the math on that. I don't remember how long it took us, but I think that at the end we ended up doing I ended up reading the last 80 pages in one day. So it was mostly 50 until the very end, and then I couldn't stop and just leave 30 pages left. That would have been kind of ridiculous. So I just read it in short snippets, and I like that because this book takes place in World War II, and so there is some kind of hard subjects and hard scenes, and so just getting that 50 pages a day, I could read that, and then I could pick up something kind of lighthearted after that. So this takes place during World War II. It follows two perspectives. Our main two perspectives are a boy who is from Germany named Werner, and then the other character is a girl who is blind who lives in France, and her name's Mariko. And Mariko, I don't know. I don't speak French, so I have a really hard time saying her name. Even though I listened to half of this on the audiobook, I still cannot pronounce her name correctly. So she, sorry, I have a little thing to get rid of. Those two perspectives, it was fun following the two different sides, because one being a French girl who's living in a Nazi occupied city, and the other one being a man who starts as a boy who was from Germany and is taken into the Nazi army. It was interesting getting both perspectives, and you feel sympathy for both perspectives. There were times I was telling the person I was buddy reading with that he is in the Nazi army. I'm supposed to be repulsed by him because that's your first reaction when you think of Nazis. But then you hear his whole story, how he was forced to be in there. He is an orphan and he doesn't have any other prospects. And when they ask him to join, it's not like he can get out of it by running away. He has no money. He has nowhere to go. And so there's this feeling of, what are you going to do? How does he have any options in this world? And whether he agrees with what's going on or not, he's kind of stuck in that situation. And we just followed these two characters, and I really enjoyed seeing their personal experiences. Sometimes when I read World War II books, I get frustrated because it feels like they're trying to give you this whole big perspective of the war from all the different sides. And that's not what I want to know. I mean, I can read a nonfiction book if I want an overall view of the war. What I want from a novel is I want to follow people that lived during the war and how their lives were affected. And that's what this book is, and that's why I loved it. Because we see these two characters before the war, how they're living, what happens during the war to them, and even after the war ends. So we see the whole thing, and then there's other characters thrown in, people that are related to those two, people that they meet along the way. And then there's one kind of bad guy that we're kind of halfway through the book, we start following him too. So we're following these different people at all stages of the war, and I just really enjoyed seeing that and how their lives are affected along the way, and also how they live their day-to-day lives during a war-torn time. And it was just really amazing. So if you have it sitting on your shelf and you just think it's too intimidating because it's big, I would suggest doing the same thing, just do little snippets a day, and it was really good. I went back and forth between the physical book and the audiobook so that I could kind of pick it up whenever I wanted to, and I thought the audiobook narrator did a really great job. So if you prefer to do a big book on audio, it's 16 hours long, so you could do that. And I just really enjoyed it. And then the other book I read for Tome Topple was the graphic novel Blankets by Craig Thompson. And this is obviously a huge book. It was around almost 600 pages of a graphic novel, and I love this. I gave it 4 stars, and the reason I gave it 4 instead of 5 is that the art didn't really necessarily speak to me. Like, it wasn't like my style of art. It's all black and white. And I mean, he's obviously very talented and everything. It's just, I think that art in graphic novels is very perspective per person, whether you connect with it. And I didn't fully connect with the art, but the story was amazing. So for me, it's 4 stars for the story. And I enjoyed the art enough that I like the story as a whole. And even though it says novel on here, it says an illustrated novel by Craig Thompson, I kind of think that this might be more a memoir. It doesn't say that anywhere, but like sometimes online people say it's a memoir, and in the book the main character is Craig Thompson, so I'm assuming that it's more autobiographical. And I found that I really like graphic novels that are graphic memoirs, because you really get to see that person's experience and how they saw the world by seeing the pictures. And this one was just an amazing story. It's kind of all about his childhood, his interaction with his brother, and then it goes mostly into most of the time is his adolescence. And so we see him struggling with religion. His family is very conservative religion. I don't know what denomination, but they're Christian and they're very conservative, and he was raised that way. And him as a teenager kind of figuring out what he really believes, and then also him meeting and falling for his first love. And we just followed that whole story. And, you know, it's just something that a lot of people can relate to, how you felt about the first person that you really had those big feelings for. And by having it during adolescence, all the, like, hormones and things that are going on in your world that are related to that. And so it's just a really amazing story. Usually I could sit down and read a graphic novel very quickly, but this one took me about 3 days because it is a really heavy one. But I just enjoyed the story. The other thing about it being a graphic memoir and pictures related to the story there and the title, there's a lot of stuff about blankets and winter and snow in this book. And as somebody, this takes place mostly in Wisconsin and Michigan, and as somebody that's from the Midwest, I really connected with that visual of snow and how blankets can conjure up memories for you of your childhood and things, and beds and all that stuff that is really part of the winter, snuggling up and all that. And I really liked that imagery and the way he connected it to his childhood memories. So if you really want to like try a graphic novel that feels like a real novel, I would suggest picking this up, because since it's so big, it is really a full-on story of a lot of his growing up years. So those are the 2 I read for Tome Topple. And those were the readathons I did. I also read a couple books from a while ago. I did a video called Rereading My Old Favorites, where I'm rereading books that I read more than 10 years ago. And I read 2 more of those at the beginning of this month. And I listened to both of these on audiobook. And one of them I had already listened to on audiobook, and the other one I had done the physical book the first time, and this time audiobook. And I really enjoyed both as audiobooks. And I enjoyed both books reading them the second time, which is good, because the other ones I had read last month in June that I reread, I didn't like them as much now 10 years later. But these 2 I enjoyed both of them. And the first one is Prey by Michael Crichton. And Michael Crichton writes a ton of, you know, sci-fi books. They're kind of a little thrillery sci-fi. This one is about nanotechnology and, you know, so like really small robots. And I don't really want to say more, because part of the whole thing of the story is the suspense that's built as you learn more and more about the technology. And like I said, I listened to the audiobook, and what I didn't realize is that I was listening to the abridged version. It was only 6 hours long, and there's a lot of books that are only 6 hours long when I listen to them on audiobook, so I didn't think anything of it. The reason I found out it was abridged, because it didn't say on the script, it did not say abridged. I was like halfway through and I missed a little section, so I went and I got the book and I was trying to like find it in the book, and I was like, there's parts in here that are not in my audiobook. And then I really realized this is an abridged audiobook. But as an abridged audiobook, so if you were to find the 6-hour version, I think there's also a 12-hour version that I found later on. I stuck with the 6 hours since I was already halfway through, and I found that I wasn't missing anything. I had read this before, and I read it on audiobook the first time back in my early 20s, and I don't know whether I had the abridged version or not because it was so long ago. but when I was listening to it, I did not notice anything, gaps in the plot line. So maybe the abridged is better, because sometimes Michael Crichton can be really dry and go on and on about the like technology part, and people get lost a little bit. So maybe it's better to be the abridged version. It was also narrated by Robert Sean Leonard, and I really just liked his voice throughout the story. And there was a lot of suspense built. At the beginning, you were kind of like feeling there's something not right. Like the narrator, the man who, I don't remember what his name is. It doesn't even say his name. So whoever the main character is, you feel at the beginning there's something happening in his life and in his family and work that is wrong, but you don't know what it is. And as we learn more about the technology, we start to get more revealed. And I found it really suspenseful and kept me interested the whole time. So I gave it 4 stars as an audiobook. I had a lot of times where I could have put it down. I just wanted to keep listening to it as I got out of the car. I would put my headphones in and keep going. So I would recommend the abridged audiobook. I don't know, because I can't say what the full audiobook is like. And the other one that I reread was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. And I also listened to this on audiobook, and the first book in this series is narrated by Stephen Fry, and it was great. I really enjoyed him narrating it. It's 4 stars. I don't know why I don't give it 5 stars. I think it's just because a lot of times you're lost of what's happening, but that's kind of part of the book. Like for the first 3 chapters, I was like, what is going on? But that's just kind of how the story is. It's very weird, and you just never really know what's happening until you're going, and then you're like, okay, I'm starting to get these characters, I'm starting to get what's happening, and then something else really weird happens. But the whole the whole story is entertaining and fun, and I just really love it. I remember reading it back when I was probably 18, and I read the physical book the first time, and I loved it, and now, whatever that is, almost 20 years later, 18 years later, I still really enjoyed it. I love the audiobook. Stephen Fry also narrates the movie, so it's kind of fun to hear him narrate the audiobook if you've watched the movie and you've heard his voice there, or go back and watch the movie after you read the book. But if you've never read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it's just a sci-fi comedic classic, and you should read it. It's enjoyable. Just know that at the beginning you're going to be a little lost, and that's fun. It's fun. And those are the 2 ones I reread, so I did pretty good on my rereading this time. I liked them. And the last book was just a standalone. It doesn't part of any of my readathons or categories, and that was Listen to Your Heart by Kasie West. I just like to read Kasie West books, so I just picked it up. Actually, at the beginning of the month I read this, and I gave this a 4 stars. And I think that if this wasn't a Kasie West book, if I just picked this book up by a random author, I probably would have given it more like a 3. I think I bumped it up because I like Kasie West's writing. I kind of just enjoy her, so I felt bad giving it less, maybe, I don't know. But I was very conflicted when I was trying to figure out how to rate this book, because I just didn't like it as much as there are others. And I know I'm the minority, because I went on Goodreads and Amazon, and everybody was giving it 5s and 4s, and nobody was disliking it. But I don't know, I think the problem is that a lot of her books have something else going on. When I read By Your Side, it's a romance, but then it also is talking about anxiety. And On the Fence is, again, romance, but it's also talking about a girl kind of figuring out who she is, and, her family has issues with her mother's death and all that stuff. So there's more than just a romance. And this one, it just felt like a romance. It didn't have a lot of extra plot to it. When you read the synopsis, that's basically all there is. There's not really a lot of surprises. There's not more about her character that you're learning. And so it just kind of was for me, because basic romance, that's in the middle. It's not spectacular. And there was a lot of times when I was feeling really uncomfortable about the romance in this book. And I can't really tell you why, because that would give it away. Because there's kind of a little mystery about who the romance is going to be. It was more just this dynamic of her and the love interest and her friend, and like kind of the dynamic between all of them. And there's like there's like two possible love interests and her best friend and her. And the four of them, their dynamic with each other just really made me uncomfortable sometimes. And that might just be me. Everybody else seems to think it's a light, fluffy romance, but there were times I was just like, oh, I don't feel right about this romance. And at times, it all ended up okay, which actually made me even more upset because I felt like there should have been conversations had amongst some of the people in that like square that never really happened. It's like everything just worked out okay and nobody's upset about liking the person that the other person likes or whatever. Like none of that stuff really came up at the end. So I don't know, maybe I was reading too much into it, but it was fine. I mean, if you want a summer romance, go ahead. I just felt like there wasn't a lot of extra to it, so if you're just looking for romance, great. And maybe you won't feel any of those dynamics because it doesn't seem like anybody else did but me. I'm just weird for some reason. I don't know. I can't really go into it more because I don't want to spoil it for you. And I don't want to turn you off of the book because, you know, most people seem to like it. So it's not bad. I'll say that. I do like Kasie West. I'm going to continue to read her books. It's not like this turns me off of her. So those are all the books I read the first 2 months of July. So I'll see you guys later. Thanks. Bye.